Hello, 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 and welcome to the Why Isn't My Brain Working Part 2 class. This is Kimsey Self speaking. I will be presenting this class today. I'm also the owner and founder of Progressive Health and Wellness, and I am so excited to talk with you about functional brain chemistry and how to save your brain. In the last class, in Part 1, we talked largely about the mechanisms that cause or how the system breaks down, right? So we talked about the microglia activation and brain inflammation. We talked about the excitatory model of neurodegeneration. So basically when the nerves become overexcited or overstimulated to the point that it causes death. And then we also talked about mitochondrial dysfunction, or in other words, kind of an energy crisis. Your brain isn't able to utilize energy appropriately and produce it to engage in all of the functions that it needs to. So I'm excited to talk to you guys today about why this happens, right? What causes it? What activities, what events in our everyday life contribute to the breakdown and the degeneration of our brains? As some of you might know, this is one of my very favorite topics. I've personally struggled with brain fog and hormone imbalance, different issues that thankfully I was able to overcome. And now I'm in a position, especially through continuing education and just clinical experience and additional research, I'm in a position to help others do the same. So I'm extremely passionate about this topic. And today we're going to cover the main issues, right? The most common issues that I see clinically that cause this brain dysfunction, this brain degeneration. So we're going to start with looking into dysglycemia, which is a fancy word for imbalanced blood sugar. We'll talk about how both hyper primarily and then touch on how hypoglycemia affect the brain. Then we'll talk about gut dysfunction, how there's an intimate connection between the intestines and the brain, and how that's a bidirectional relationship. How everything from food sensitivities to an imbalance of the gut bacteria to stress can impact brain function. And then we'll also talk about gluten. I know gluten-free is kind of a fad. A lot of people don't believe that it's true, or a lot of people think that unless you have celiac disease, gluten is fine. But gluten is actually one of the worst things for the nervous system. And I'll show you research and talk about why that is. Please keep in mind, I wish I had more than just an hour, but please keep in mind that there are so many other causes of neurodegeneration. One of the biggest ones that I see is traumatic brain injury. So just to kind of put it out there, traumatic brain injury, TBI for short, can be as obvious as a concussion where the person actually blacks out for a period of time or kind of sees stars. But it can also be as innocuous as just kind of hitting your head and feeling a little off, feeling a little woozy for a second, but then picking up and going along with your day. So it doesn't have to be, the word traumatic. Don't let the word traumatic necessarily throw you off. Basically what TBI implies is that there's residual brain inflammation and an energy crisis that occurs and those effects can last for sometimes years post the event. So TBI, toxicity, here we're talking about, environmental toxicity. There's been over 80,000 chemicals introduced into our environment in the last 100 years. Heavy metals are increasing. So exposure to various toxins profoundly influences the brain and the nervous system. Unfortunately, that in and of itself is a whole topic, so we won't really get to that today. But some of the mechanisms that I'm talking about today, like gut dysbiosis, for example, can overlap in a lot of ways with toxicity. Nutrient deficiencies. The brain is one of the most sensitive organs to nutrient status, including fuel, like in glucose or ketone bodies, but also micronutrients like vitamins and minerals. Any kind of a deficiency can significantly impact brain function. And then there's so much more, and I could go on forever and ever. I originally designed this class to be a 4-hour class and then broke it up into 2 pieces, the part 1 and the part 2 that you see today. But honestly, I could go on for days on this. So let's jump into the nitty gritty. As I mentioned, we're going to talk first about dysglycemia, or imbalanced blood sugar and insulin levels. So let's go over some of the symptoms associated with blood sugar dysregulation. On the left-hand side, we have symptoms of low blood sugar or hypoglycemia. So the brain, even though it only weighs 2% of our body weight, it demands 20 to 40% of our fuel supply, which is why when I say fuel supply, I mean blood sugar typically, unless you're doing a ketogenic diet, but blood sugar in this case, which is why some of the first symptoms to come on with low blood sugar are neurological in nature. As you see here, shakiness, irritability, like that hangry feeling. Hangry is not normal. I know it's become a Snickers commercial, but it's not normal. Fatigue, confusion, disorientation. You can also notice feeling energized after eating. So if you go from feeling a little sluggish or foggy and then you eat a meal and you feel energy or more clear, that can be a sign of hypoglycemia. Normally, when blood sugar is regulated appropriately, you shouldn't feel any changes in energy after eating, right? You shouldn't be tired before it. You shouldn't feel energized after it. And then conversely, you also shouldn't feel fatigued after eating, which we'll talk about when we look at hyperglycemia. Cravings for sweets between meals. This is because sweets are loaded in sugar and they will be the fastest to raise your blood sugar. Dependent on coffee or sugar to keep going. Coffee stimulates the stress response, and cortisol and adrenaline both raise blood sugar also. Not to mention, obviously, there's typically a feeling of fatigue, like we just talked about when blood sugar is low, so people will often grab for coffee in those cases. Poor memory and forgetfulness, and then also blurred vision. Now, on the other side, the flip side of things, symptoms of hyperglycemia or high blood sugar. Fatigue after meals, especially high carbohydrate meals. I can go into the mechanisms behind this in a few minutes, but basically what's happening is the glucose that you just ate is not able to efficiently get into your cells because the cells have become desensitized to insulin, which is kind of the key that unlocks the door to get glucose into the cell. So what starts happening is glucose is converted into fat, because it has to get out of the blood somehow, and fatty acid or fatty tissue, adipose tissue, will always take in glucose. That energy conversion is very energy demanding too. So that, coupled with the cells think that they're starving, there's various mechanisms that cause fatigue after meals, but that is a classic sign. Constant general fatigue, constant hunger. Again, the cells aren't getting the glucose they need because they've become desensitized to insulin. So at a cellular level, the cells think that they're hungry when really there's an excess of fuel. But that's part of what triggers this hunger response. And then we can get into other hormones like leptin too. Constant cravings for sweets, especially after meals. This again goes back to the body attempting to get glucose into the cell. Frequent urination, trying to eliminate the glucose, and it creates a lot of water in this whole process. Difficulty losing weight and migrating aches and pains. So, blood sugar in a normal day-to-day basis, in a normal state, glucose or blood sugar, those terms can be used interchangeably, is the primary fuel source for all of our cells. So ideally, we want blood sugar to stay within a very narrow range throughout the day so that all of our cells have the sufficient supply of glucose that they need in order to perform their metabolic functions. Think of it like if you're driving a car cross country, you want to rely on that tank of gas staying full and then slowly declining, and then stop to a gas station, fill it up, and drive for another 300 miles and it slowly declines, right? Predictable. Same concept applies here. If you're driving that car cross country and you start with a full tank of gas and then all of a sudden it just goes to empty and then suddenly goes to full and then suddenly goes to empty and you don't know what's happening with it or what to predict, that could seriously affect your road trip, right? I mean, if you're just hitting empty all of a sudden, then we've got a problem. Same concept applies here. So I like to see optimal blood glucose levels between 75 and 90. If you're reading lab work, fasting blood glucose, I prefer to see between 75 and 90. Lab reference ranges are going to be broader because they're screening for disease rather than prevention. I'm screening for prevention. So the lab reference range, I believe, goes from something like 60 to 99 or somewhere around there. which is pretty excessive range, but again, they're screening for disease. So if it's outside of that range, too low, below 60 would be hypoglycemia, too high would be hyperglycemia, and then, we can look at the mechanisms as to why. So what I was just describing with the cross-country road trip example is a blood sugar roller coaster. So what happens here, this is what we call dysglycemia, one form of dysglycemia. You see that same green bar, that's the normal, ideal range for glucose to be, but what can happen through a variety of different factors, namely diet, we'll do this, a high carbohydrate and inflammatory diet, like the standard American diet. Stress levels will significantly do this because insulin, the blood sugar regulating hormone, and cortisol, the stress hormone, compete with each other. So if one is high, the other one has to spike higher. We'll talk about that more in just a second. Even dysbiosis, imbalances in the gut bacteria can cause blood sugar roller coasters. Toxicity and inflammation can lead to insulin desensitivity. So there's many different factors that can do this. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening is you get this swing throughout the day, these drastic swings. So instead of little molehills and valleys, you've got peaks, and then the blood sugar plummets down below. Well, whenever the blood sugar is elevated, so when we're seeing this like at the high end of these peaks, insulin, as you can see here, has to spike higher by default in order to try to get, lower the blood sugar, in order to try to get the glucose into the cell. Here's the thing. One, our cells need glucose just to, like I said, carry out their metabolic functions, their daily tasks. But two, glucose is also tightly regulated because blood sugar is kind of like it's like a Chinese throwing star in the blood. It damages and nicks and damages blood vessel walls and also brain tissue, like nerve cells. So we don't want excess blood sugar remaining in the blood for prolonged periods of time, right? It's not doing anything and it's actually causing harm. So insulin's job is to shuttle the blood sugar out of the vascular system, out of the blood, into the cells where it can actually be used for energy. Now, coming back to the point that I was making before about these high insulin levels, two things happen here. When blood sugar spikes high, insulin has to spike higher in order to drive the blood sugar into the cell. Well, when this is repeatedly happening, and especially when one is either under stress or frequently consuming high carbohydrate, high sugar meals or snacks, then what happens is insulin drives the blood sugar too low, below normal physiological levels. And then so I'm pointing here to that red zone where it says hunger. You feel a sensation of hunger. Typically, it'll come on pretty fast too, and so you want to reach for like sugary snacks, coffee, something to raise the blood sugar fast, which then raises blood sugar back up. And the exact same thing happens again. Insulin spikes higher, and then it drives back down. This is called reactionary hypoglycemia. It's actually kind of a pre-diabetes, if you will. Because from here, what happens is the sugar will start to swing high again. Insulin will swing higher. And I want you guys to get a visual for a second. If you had a nosy neighbor that keeps coming over every day, several times a day, knocking on your door, knock, 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 all the time, eventually you're just going to pretend like you're not home, right? You won't answer the door. Same exact mechanism, essentially, is happening in insulin resistance. So at these peaks, these kind of high levels of sugar and insulin's coming around to the cells, virtually all cells in the body, knocking on the door. Hey, it's me again. I got to let some blood sugar in. Hey, it's me again. I got to let some glucose in. And eventually the cells stop answering. And what I mean by that is quite literally they downregulate their receptors for insulin. So insulin can no longer bind to the cell in order to open the doorway to allow glucose in. quite literally, a normal healthy cell has about 100,000 receptors for insulin. 100,000 receptors for insulin. A diabetic cell, on the other hand, has about 10,000. So that'll give you an idea of what we're talking about when I say insulin resistance. Well, considering the fact that insulin is the primary blood sugar lowering hormone, if insulin's not able to do its job because of cellular resistance, glucose is going to slowly accumulate in the blood. And now we have a problem. When this continues to happen, insulin will attempt to spike higher, kind of like it's screaming at the cells. The cells become even more dysregulated, even more desensitized. Blood sugar continues to accumulate, and now we move into diabetes. The same thing, the same mechanism, when we talk about this occurring in the in the brain, the brain is very, very sensitive to glucose changes, not only hypo, but hyper as well. Here are the two main reasons why. One, I mentioned that glucose is kind of like a Chinese throwing star in the blood and to nerve cells. It's toxic. It creates injury that activates the immune system, which is inflammation. So hyperglycemia, high blood sugars, is a pathway towards inflammation in the brain. The second reason is because I want to point out these astrocytes down below. These astrocytes are a type of glial cell. Glial cells are just supportive cells in the brain. So the brain is comprised of both neurons, which are nerve cells, and glial cells, which are supportive cells to make sure that the neurons are functioning appropriately. They regulate ion levels and nutrients and the immune system. When I'm talking about nutrients, I also mean glucose. So what we're looking at right here is the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is maintained by both astrocytes, a specialized type of neurological cell, as well as tiny capillaries or blood vessels. Blood-brain barrier, as it implies, it's supposed to keep all things out that are not selectively absorbed and or the very, very, very small molecules that just kind of are allowed to kind of leak in or seep in. It's a protective mechanism, in other words. Well, astrocytes also they're the only cell in the brain that has a receptor for insulin. So in insulin, we've got these constant insulin surges. It's going to degrade the integrity and the health of the astrocytes. And that leads into a degrading blood-brain barrier, or a quote, leaky brain. Some of you might have heard of leaky gut, and if not, we'll briefly talk about that in a couple of minutes. For more information on leaky gut, be sure to check out my Why Is It My Digestion Working class, because I go into it in a lot more depth there. But basically what starts happening is toxins, microbes, inflammatory molecules, various things that would never normally be able to cross into the brain now are. They're leaking through because of these damaged blood-brain barrier caused in one way by insulin surges or hyperglycemia. Once they're in the brain, they can wreak havoc, stimulating the brain's immune system and damaging mitochondria. This is part of the reason why type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease have so many overlaps, to the point that many researchers refer to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes or brain-based diabetes. New research has come out pointing to the fact that even infection is associated with Alzheimer's. So really at the end of the day, to boil it down, a very, very simplistic view of Alzheimer's is inflammation. It's inflammation induced, defining inflammation as the immune system's response to injury. The immune system's response to injury. There's 3 categories of injury. There's physical injury, like a TBI, chemical injury, like what we're talking about here with blood sugar, chemical toxicity, dysbiosis, food sensitivities, and then there's emotional injury, like emotional stress. With the appropriate genetics, all of that can result in Alzheimer's. We're going to keep talking about the role that diabetes or hyperglycemia plays in Alzheimer's. This graphic here was pulled directly from a research study showing the overlaps, right, between dysregulated blood sugar and Alzheimer's disease. So we'll look in the middle here, seeing how elevated blood sugar triggers inflammation, causes oxidative stress, or think of like iron rusting. Same concept with oxidative stress just occurring in the body. Impaired insulin signaling, I'm jumping down a little bit, and insulin resistance, which we talked about. Glucose intolerance, that goes hand in hand with the insulin signaling and resistance. And then cognitive deficits. So I want to point out here to this increased rage and ages. This is another factor because, okay, here's an analogy. This happens with elevated glucose. This is what can happen to the proteins that are in your body. And proteins regulate so many physiological functions, right? Proteins are life. Imagine you're sucking on a lollipop, take the lollipop, let it dry out in the air for a second. It becomes sticky, right? This is essentially what a glycosylated end product is. And age is advanced glycosylated end products. RAGE is reactive advanced glycosylated end products. They result from oxidative damage from elevated glucose, and they're chemically very sticky. So it's a protein sugar compound that becomes very sticky. This can affect red blood cells. That's what hemoglobin A1C, a lab marker, is measuring. This can affect many different things. But keeping the focus on the brain, and in this case, Alzheimer's, think of these sticky proteins, right? And two of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease are plaques that form, specifically beta amyloid plaque that forms when protein pieces clump together, these beta amyloid proteins clump together, and then also tau proteins. So tau proteins maintain the integrity of microtubules. Think of microtubules like the train tracks that keep the train going in the right direction. And that train is carrying nutrients, right? Just imagine that train is carrying nutrients, blood sugar for fuel. It's carrying a lot of important things, neurotransmitters. And the tau proteins are the tracks. Well, what happens is with these tau proteins and with hyperglycemia specifically, instead of just normal degradation where like, hey, these tracks are kind of falling apart, let's get in and recycle those and build new ones. Instead of that process occurring in a normal fashion, these tau proteins start to tangle. So it would be like the train tracks just tangling and folding over all over itself, right? I mean, if a train comes, it's obviously going to stop dead in the tracks. None of the nutrients can be delivered, none of the fuel, none of the neurotransmitters. Eventually what happens is that the nerve cell that's on the receiving end of that dies because it's not getting its stimulation. It's not getting what it needs. Its nutrients, its activation, right? The train can't get through. Same exact function, essentially, again, bear with me on these analogies, is happening here. So this whole process, now we've got these tau protein tangles, so the nerve cells aren't getting the nutrients or the activation that they need, and they're eventually dying. We have these beta amyloid plaques that are kind of like a beaver dam damming up a river. Same concept, the nerve cells start to die. And all of this triggers the inflammatory response, which just fuels this and keeps this whole process going, literally adding insult to injury. When this happens in the cortex and in the hippocampus specifically, this is what eventually leads to the complications associated with Alzheimer's disease. So I went through all of that to highlight not only the mechanisms of Alzheimer's, but also neurodegeneration, and specifically how, all of this started with hyperglycemia. So in Alzheimer's, the hallmarks are these tau proteins and beta amyloid plaques. However, independent of having those, the hyperglycemia will still degrade the blood-brain barrier. It will still damage and kill neurons. It will still activate the brain's immune system, causing inflammation. It's it does all of this in everyone, not just those that are genetically susceptible, but in everyone. This is one of the main reasons why dysglycemia is kind of a deal breaker when it comes to nutrition and medicine, because meaning we have to address it, right? If blood sugar is imbalanced, we have to deal with that in order for many other things to come into line. This study here is just pointing out, we just talked about Alzheimer's, but this study written by a chiropractic neurologist who I've seen speak before, he's just absolutely brilliant. He says here, basically highlighting the connection between blood sugar and depression. So it's not just Alzheimer's, right? It's not just dementia. We can also look at dysglycemia and hyperglycemia with depression, anxiety, brain fog, fatigue, insomnia. There's many different neurological conditions, brain-based conditions that come along with hyperglycemia or hypo for that matter. Okay, next we're going to shift gears and get into the gut-brain connection and gluten. I included gluten in this section as well because gluten not only affects the gut, which then affects the brain, it also affects the brain independently. So let's get through here. I apologize up front about the quality of this image. I know it's slightly blurry, but I just love that it really touched on all of the hallmarks of this section in a fairly visually appealing way. But really what this is showing is how the GI tract can influence the central nervous system. And one thing that I love is notice how basically all of these have bidirectional arrows, meaning one impacts the other and vice versa. So starting up at the top, we'll start here with just microbiota changes. That's changes in the gut microbiome. So we'll talk more about that in just a second, but to give you an idea, there's about 2 to 5 pounds of bacteria that live in the intestines. And they are so metabolically active and they impact our immune system and genetic expression so much that researchers are starting to consider them another organ system like the liver or the brain, right? So they are significant. If we have an overgrowth of bad bacteria or not enough good bacteria, then we can start to have a problem, including brain-based concerns. So changes in the gut microbiome. Then we're moving this way. We've got gut epithelial breakdown or leaky gut syndrome, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Same really overriding concept to leaky brain as well. We've got immune activation by endotoxemia. So coming back up to the microbiota changes, these what are called gram-negative bacteria, lipopolysaccharides are fragments of their cell walls. And when those fragments seep through our intestinal lining into systemic circulation or into blood circulation, they're highly reactive, highly inflammatory, and highly toxic, and signal a significant immune response. These, frankly put, can wreak havoc on our entire body. Everything from fibromyalgia to Alzheimer's to depression to heart disease to cancer is all associated with endotoxemia stimulated by lipopolysaccharides. So again, it highlights the importance of microbial balance in the intestines. And then we've got inflammation, blood-brain barrier breakdown, very similar to leaky gut, alterations in neurotransmitter levels. So we have quite literally a second brain in our intestines. In fact, 90% of the serotonin, which is our calming, relaxed, feel-good neurotransmitter or brain chemical, 90% of our serotonin is actually made in the intestines by the microbiome. So if we have an imbalance in the gut flora, we won't have appropriate serotonin levels. And this can lead to symptoms like depression or conditions like depression. In addition, blood sugar is very impacting on serotonin levels specifically because tryptophan is kind of like the runt of the amino acids. Tryptophan is the precursor to serotonin. And if there's imbalanced blood sugar, tryptophan won't be able to get into the brain, where serotonin is then produced for the brain. So many different connections here. Changes in synaptic plasticity, in other words, your brain's ability to grow and build new connections. Neural and behavioral and mood changes, and then stress and dietary or environmental triggers. All of these can impact the gut, which then impacts the brain, and vice versa. So the question arises, like, wait a minute, how are the gut and the brain talking? Like, they're not even, geographically close to each other as far as the body goes. So this brings us to the vagus nerve. As I mentioned, in the intestines, there is quote unquote a second brain. This is referred to as the enteric nervous system, and it also must have input from the brain. So this is a very, very bidirectional relationship. The brain controls the intestines influence the brain. The pathway that mediates this, the neurological pathway that mediates this the most, not only pathway, but the most, is from the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is largely associated with the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. We have two branches in the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic meaning automatic. We don't think about it. There's the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight stress mode. And then there's the parasympathetic nervous system, which is its counterpart. It's the calming, rest, and digest branch of the autonomic nervous system. The vagus nerve mediates that calming, rest, and digest side. It originates out of the brainstem and innervates basically everything within the trunk and in the abdominal area, right? So many vital organs within this area. Everything from the heart and the lungs to the intestines. So when I'm going to kind of paint a picture for you guys, the name of the game with the nervous system is if you don't use it, you lose it. So normal function involves healthy intestines, healthy microbial balance, healthy digestion, sending appropriate nerve signals to the brain saying, hey, we're doing great down here. Like, we're about to eat. Would you mind stimulating the stomach to release hydrochloric acid, for example? Or we just ate a meal. Can you help us with peristalsis? Various communication messages. And then the brain's like, yeah, no problem, and signals whatever the intestines need. That would be normal, and that a lot of that is mediated by the vagus nerve. One common mechanism of abnormal, actually I should say two. One, the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome influences that communication pathway and is actually able to send chemical messages via the vagus nerve, but also independent of the vagus nerve, to the brain, relaying the status of the intestines. That's one mechanism. The second mechanism is looking at the sympathetic nervous system, that sympathetic overdrive. So let's be real. We live in an overstressed society. A lot of people are locked into sympathetic dominance, meaning it's like they're always running from lions. They're always on the go. They're always stressed out. The sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system cannot be activated at the same time. It's one or the other. As I mentioned a second ago, if you don't use it, you lose it with the nervous system. So if we're always activating the sympathetic nervous system at the expense of the parasympathetic nervous system, again, mediated by the vagus nerve, then those nerves, that nerve bundle can start to atrophy. And we now have weak stimulation, weak connection between the brain and the gut. Those are just a couple of examples as to how we can start to lose that connection, which then leads to degenerative changes. Here's a functional test that you can use to evaluate the status of your vagus nerve. Actually, let me preface also, it's possible for digestive issues, constipation, diarrhea, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, dysbiosis of any kind, gas, bloating, to be mediated, to be more of a neurological problem, right? To be mediated by the vagus nerve with poor integrity, and the brain and the intestines are not able to communicate effectively, and it's manifesting as these intestinal issues. So here are two tests that you can do to evaluate the health of your vagus nerve. It's a gag reflex test and the Palatine arches. So in the gag reflex test, you just get a clean device, let's say a popsicle stick, stick it on the back of your tongue, and normally it should stimulate the gag reflex, right? If it doesn't, if you're sitting there, I have clients do this sometimes, and they're sitting there like practically jabbing the back of their throat with these popsicle sticks. If it doesn't, that indicates neuropathy, or I would say neurodegeneration within the vagus nerve. If it's hypersensitive, so talking about adults that gag when they're brushing their teeth or have difficulty swallowing pills, if it's hypersensitive, then that indicates that the nerves are at threshold and any little thing can tip them over. That's kind of a precursor to eventual neurodegeneration. So neither one is good. That's the gag reflex test. The Palatine arches reflex is, so looking at, it's not really a reflex, it's more of a response. Looking down at the image of the mouth in the lower right-hand corner, you see the uvula, the little dangly thing in the back of the throat, and then these two arches on either side. The Palatine arches are what we're talking about, those two arches right there. If you lean your head back, you'll have to have somebody help you with this. If you lean your head back and say, ah, and hold it like that, both of those arches should rise at the same time and stay elevated for as long as you're saying ah. If they don't, if one doesn't rise, if either don't rise, or if one or the other doesn't rise, or if they rise and then immediately fall, even while you're still maintaining the ah, then that shows weak stimulation and possible neurodegeneration of the vagus nerve. So there are exercises, functional exercises that you can do to neurologically stimulate and strengthen the vagus nerve. This includes gargling with water, quite literally just multiple times throughout the day, gargle with water for as long as you can. Stimulating the gag reflex, so sitting there and gagging yourself with a clean utensil. And singing loudly, I mean loudly, belting, kind of where you start to get that sore, fatigued throat feeling, right? Do it in your car, do it when no one's home if you live with people. But all three of these are functional exercises to help stimulate and regain the integrity of the vagus nerve. Okay, we're going to slightly switch gears a little bit, and we're going to start talking about inflammation or the immune system and the role that this plays in brain health, stemming specifically from the intestines. So leaky gut syndrome, I mentioned that we would go over this. Leaky gut syndrome is where, okay, actually let me back up. The intestines are one long skin tube that run from one end all the way down to the other, right? It's the closest that the outside world comes in contact with our inside world, right? Quite literally, when we eat, we're making part of the outside world part of our inside world. Because of this, the body in its innate wisdom put a really strong defense mechanism here, figuring if we're going to be invaded by a microbe or by a toxin, there's a pretty good chance it's going to be through the intestines. So let's put most of our troops and barrier systems there. So about 70 to 80% of the immune system resides in the intestines. And then we have various barrier systems, like hydrochloric acid being one of them in the stomach, and then also the intestinal lining itself. The intestinal lining is supposed to be very, very tightly bound, meaning nothing can get through unless it is selectively escorted or absorbed, in other words. Keep in mind, everything I'm describing here also applies to the blood-brain barrier. They're almost identical. Okay, so nothing is supposed to get through unless it is absorbed. Now, through various mechanisms, dysbiosis, which we talked about, food sensitivities, emotional stress, toxicity, certain medications can do this, many different things can lead to the breakdown or loss of integrity of the intestinal linings. When this happens, large undigested food particles, toxins, different microbes can now inappropriately leak through the lining into systemic circulation, where it then triggers the immune system, and it essentially keeps inflammation at a dull roar. It keeps the red alert activated. It is this mechanism, leaky gut syndrome or increased intestinal permeability. This mechanism is why it's estimated about 80% of disease arises in the intestines. That's why the gut is getting so much attention in functional medicine these days, or for the past several years. Like I said, though, pretty much that whole thing can occur in the blood-brain barrier as well. Same mechanisms, almost identical. So, it raises the question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? What came first, gut dysfunction or brain dysfunction? To give you an idea, and then I'll move on to this gluten sensitivity slide, sufferers of traumatic brain injury, there was a study that found after experiencing a traumatic brain injury, leaky gut syndrome was induced within 30 minutes of the injury, so almost immediately. And, in all fairness, vice versa. You have a yeast overgrowth in the intestines can lead to degenerative changes within the blood-brain barrier. This brings me to gluten. Gluten, so like I said at the beginning of this class, it's so confusing out there what you can trust in the media or just other people's opinions. Many people believe that gluten sensitivity is a fad. It's not a real thing. Only people with celiac disease should avoid gluten. And I'm going to clear that up right now. First and foremost, celiac disease is a completely different ballgame. What happens in celiac disease is whenever the immune system sees gluten, it attacks both gluten and the lining of the intestine, specifically the microvilli, which are kind of these specialized cells of the intestines. It's molecular mimicry. Gluten to the immune system, gluten looks like the intestinal lining, so it goes after both. It's an autoimmune condition. However, it's possible to be gluten sensitive without having an autoimmune condition, A, meaning the immune system only goes after gluten, but it doesn't attack healthy tissue. And B, gluten sensitivity is not limited to just celiac disease when it comes to aggravating autoimmune conditions, right? If it can happen in celiac, it can happen with virtually all autoimmune conditions, and it does. So at this point, the literature has found associations between gluten sensitivity and every major part of the nervous system. I pulled this directly from the functional brain chemistry 3-day seminar that I went to. And they outlined all of these mechanisms, showing the various aspects of the nervous system that are impacted by gluten. Very simply put, gluten is the most toxic protein to the nervous system, period, end of story. I'm going to go explain why. Here's one study. I try to intersperse these studies throughout this presentation just to show that this is not just my opinion. This is not just me saying this. There is additional research being done out here showing the issues between, or the benefits behind a lot of what I'm saying. In this case, to summarize this study, it looked at over 9,000 adults. The study design was to compare the rate basically of undiagnosed celiac disease. It was designed to answer the question, are celiac disease rates actually increasing, or are we just getting better at diagnosis? And what it concluded is that the rate of undiagnosed celiac disease was 4.5 times and greater in recent studies than in a study that was conducted back in the 1950s. So if you want to go through and actually read the study, feel free to pause this presentation and you can go through and read it. If you type in increased prevalence in mortality in undiagnosed celiac disease, especially into Google Scholar, you can probably find the entire study. But just to summarize it for time's sake, that is what the study concluded, is that celiac disease rates are in fact on the rise. A lot of this is because we are not eating our grandmother's wheat, right? So a lot of people that say, oh, gluten-free is a fad, try to say that we've been eating wheat for thousands of years and it's been fine. Why is it all of a sudden a problem? And here's your answer to them. We're not eating the same wheat. We're not eating the same gluten, even as recently as 50 years ago. So wheat is not genetically modified. Wheat is not a GMO plant. However, it has been significantly deamidated and hybridized, which is making it more immunoreactive. So hybridization, I'm going to drop down to the bottom bullet point. Hybridization is the process of basically combining specific strains of wheat in order to enhance the expression of specific qualities. Take like broccolini, for example, right? They're combining, I don't know, I think it's broccoli and maybe zucchini. I honestly don't know. But this happens all the time. Hybridization in and of itself is not always a bad thing. It happens with produce. But when this happens over and over and over and over and over again, and eventually we get so far away from the original species, this hybridization process can change the proteome, can change the protein sequences in the wheat as much as 5% each time. And this is just hybridization. So keep in mind, the immune system reacts to proteins. Okay, so when I say proteome, I mean the protein sequence. The immune system reacts to proteins, stimulating an immune response. So when a protein sequence changes and the immune system no longer recognizes that protein, that's when we have a problem, and that's when sensitivities can arise. So that's hybridization. Deamidation is the process of enzymatically or acidically treating gluten by food processing companies so that it is soluble in water. So normally gliadin, one of the main inflammatory proteins of gluten, is not soluble in water, and therefore whenever it's added to foods for different recipes, it changes the food's qualities. But deamidation makes it soluble in water and much easier to combine with other foods. But again, this changes the protein sequence. So when this is all said and done, it ends up being what we're eating in everyday wheat products or just gluten-containing grains in general. What we're eating is significantly different compared to what we ate decades ago. And because of that, the immune system is responding accordingly. Not to mention, we also have to throw in other factors like the basically laden use of pesticides on these crops and antibiotic resistance bacteria, and there's various things that are happening that's making wheat just problematic in general. But I just wanted to point out that we're really not eating the same wheat, and our immune systems have not had a chance to keep up. This is a quote from the Frontiers in Human Neuroscience from March of 2 years ago, showing, I'm going to read this off the slide. We present the implications for physiological sciences of the findings that in all of us, bread, 1, makes the gut more permeable and thus encourage the migration of food particles to sites where they are not expected, prompting the immune system to attack both these particles and brain-relevant substances that resemble them. So in other words, leaky gut syndrome and leaky brain. And it releases opioid-like compounds capable of causing mental derangement if they make it to the brain. So what they're talking about here, and what it says, as Datis Karazian says here, there's no single dietary protein that has become more of a trigger for neurological dysfunction and neurological autoimmunity than gluten. So going back to this slide, gluten in all of us, bullet point 1, activates an enzyme called zonulin within the intestinal lining that mediates its permeability. So think of zonulin like a shoelace. If it's activated, it loosens the shoelace. It allows the intestines to become more permeable. This is very well known. They're actually manufacturing medications to target zonulin, hoping that it will help with the absorption of the medication. So gluten activates zonulin, thereby inducing leaky gut syndrome in all of us. it'll take variations in time for people, but that's independent of a sensitivity. And then secondly, by the gut bacteria, gluten and casein, the main protein in dairy, are converted into both gluteo and caseomorphins respectively, which, as you might have heard, sounds like the word endorphin, which is right. That's the opioid-like compounds here, that if they make it to the brain, it stimulates endorphins, and that's why they become physiologically addictive. Okay. The mechanisms by which this occurs, looking at the left here, process called molecular mimicry. So we're talking specifically about gluten and, here it says neurological autoimmunity, but I would argue all autoimmunity. Molecular mimicry is the process by which the gluten protein looks very similar to healthy body tissue. So when the immune system goes after gluten, it also mistakes healthy body tissue and attacks it as well, just like I described with celiac disease. That process is called molecular mimicry. And then that second bullet point here, as I just described, gluten-induced intestinal permeability versus zonulin. And GALT. GALT is basically the immune system within the intestines. So this presents, a person struggling with this presents with these relapsing conditions. They'll get better for a little bit, and then they'll get worse for a little bit, better and worse. It's incurable, but I don't like to use that term. We can manage it for sure and improve it greatly. And then also they tend to be diagnosed with conditions associated with autoimmunity, right? Like hypothyroidism, diabetes, idiopathic neuropathy, or neuropathy of an unknown origin, irritable bowel disease, Meniere's is ringing in the ears, arthritis, many different inflammatory conditions. Okay, so that summarizes the gluten part of this. And now we're going to segue into the microbiome part of this. The microbiome I've kind of hinted at along this presentation. It's the bacteria that reside within the intestines, and they influence so many different aspects of our normal physiology. The sleep-wake cycle, also referred to as the circadian rhythm, systemic immune cell activation, so inflammation in other words. So let me give you an idea. Just like you and I go to the restroom and pass gas after we eat, so do these microbes, and they release toxic byproducts, and because they're in our intestines, we then absorb them. Well, these toxic byproducts can cross the blood-brain barrier and activate the immune system within the brain. So this is what we call endotoxemia. So it can stimulate brain inflammation. Imbalanced bacteria, or dysbiosis, in other words, can stimulate brain inflammation. Now, vice versa, good bacteria actually help us synthesize nutrients. So that's how we get, for example, like B12 and vitamin K is from good bacteria. So we need bacteria, we just need them to be in appropriate levels. And the brain is very sensitive to this. Direct communication with the brain via the vagus nerve, and then they influence the architecture of sleep and stress reactivity. I'm going to read this out loud. Quote from the Journal of Medicinal Food from 2014. The intestinal microflora influence memory, mood, and cognition, and are clinically and therapeutically relevant to a range of disorders, including alcoholism, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and RLS. So the intestinal microflora plays a significant role in our overall health, but especially in the brain. There is an entire article I found fairly recently pointing to the role of the gut microbiome and the influence in schizophrenia. And they were finding an overlap between both dysbiosis and gluten sensitivity in schizophrenia. Okay, so now let's talk about what we can do about it, right? How can we save and protect our brains? There are so many things that we can do from a nutrition and lifestyle point of view, and that's what we'll talk about now. There's several, but we're going to talk about a couple of therapeutic diets, specifically ketogenic, paleo, and intermittent fasting. We'll get into various nutrients that are supportive for brain health, stress management, and exercise. So it goes without saying, the foundation of any diet, and I don't really like the term diet, but the foundation of any diet is eating a plethora of organic vegetables and fruits, brightly colored vegetables and fruits, healthy fats like avocado and nuts and seeds and coconut oil, and moderate amounts of protein, right? Grass-fed, free-range, clean, wild-caught protein. I know red meat, for example, gets a lot of bad rap, but if it's grass-fed, grass-finished cows, the fatty acid and protein composition and nutrient composition of that looks more similar to salmon than it does to like CAFO-raised beef. So totally different. Quality, quality, quality. That's the foundation of every diet. But then there's some tweaks based on the person. So ketogenic diet. Ketogenic is a very, very therapeutic diet especially for neurological conditions. Let me put up front, it is not supposed to be a lifestyle diet. It is not a long-term diet. I'll explain why. So ketosis is a state, it's a normal, or I should say natural metabolic state that occurs either in the presence of starvation or very, very, very low glucose intake. Because the body prefers to run on glucose, if glucose is an option, it'll automatically shift to burning that for fuel. If it's not an option and fat is, then the body can shift into a state of, quote, ketosis. Ketosis occurs by combining two fatty acids together to make a ketone body. I don't want to get all techie, but that's why fat is so significant, because ketone bodies are manufactured from fat. Ketone bodies are a very dense fuel supply, right? Very high energy, clean burning, dense fuel supply. The brain is 60% fat. And it's mitochondria. So there's ketone bodies are acids, and the beneficial acids, these acids can actually affect in a positive way the signaling capabilities within the brain as well. Because ketones are a very clean burning fuel too, they produce less toxic byproducts than glucose does in the brain, and they carry a lot of energy, right? They're very nutrient dense. In addition, ketones or ketosis enhances the process of what's called autophagy and mitophagy in the mitochondria. So what that means is basically in the body, you always want to have a healthy balance of building new and breaking down and recycling old proteins. You know, just like a city, you want to tear down the old buildings and build up new ones. The same thing with roads, etc. Same thing occurs in the body. When this doesn't happen appropriately, then we get problems like Alzheimer's disease with these tau protein tangles. Ketosis enhances the process of breaking down and recycling old proteins so that the body can come back and build new ones. Ketosis also helps upregulate mitochondrial biogenesis. So what this means is building new factories within the cell to produce energy. So that's where it can be really therapeutic, especially after, like, say, traumatic brain injury, for example, where they're having an energy crisis. Ketosis can be very beneficial because now we're enhancing building new factories so that we can handle and produce more energy. Then lastly, ketosis also reduces insulin surges. Thereby, we talked about the problem with insulin surges, so it'll help protect the blood-brain barrier and be anti-inflammatory to the brain. The hallmark of a ketogenic diet is that it's very high in fat and very low in carbs. As I mentioned, if carbohydrates are an option, the body will burn it for fuel. If it's not an option, the body will turn to fat to produce ketones. So quite literally, in a ketogenic diet, the diet is about 75 to 80% fat. It's significant. Very minimal starchy vegetables like kale, leafy greens, different peppers, cucumbers, for example, and then a plethora of fat. So you're literally adding tablespoons of oil to each meal, eating coconut oil and avocado and just as much fat as possible, essentially. Keep in mind, side note, this is contraindicated for anybody that does not have a gallbladder. In that case, you want to work with a professional. Protein, on the other hand, so here's the thing with protein. Protein can be converted into glucose. Long story short, protein can be converted into glucose. So that's why protein needs to be limited, not completely avoided, just limited. So you're having small portions of protein, kind of limited throughout the day, maybe 2 or so servings of protein, less than 4 ounces each time. Otherwise, it'll be converted into glucose and kick you out of ketosis. Here's a study. This is the conclusion of a study highlighting the effects of like the metabolic benefits of a ketogenic diet in the neurological arena. Again, if you want to read this study, feel free to pause the presentation. Intermittent fasting. I love intermittent fasting. So intermittent fasting came out as a result of noticing the benefits of fasting. And fasting includes going longer than 12 hours without eating and eating less than 500 calories. So highlighting the benefits of intermittent fasting and caloric restriction, but intermittent fasting allows you to do it in a reproducible way. So the benefits of intermittent fasting include lowering insulin, enhancing leptin sensitivity, which involves satiety and hunger, and lowering insulin-like growth factor 1, which can be a proliferative or kind of precancerous, if you will, hormone. It's also indicative of growth hormone levels. It promotes ketosis, it reduces oxidative stress, it promotes autophagy, and inhibits the mTOR pathway. Both autophagy and the mTOR pathway look at essentially activating the body's healing and repair mechanisms. And there's various tours of intermittent fasting. So there's the 8-16 schedule, which is the most common, where you fast for 16 hours overnight and then eat a full day's worth of calories within an 8-hour period. So within an 8-hour period, you have breakfast, lunch, dinner, a couple snacks, everything that you would normally eat, just condensed down, and then you fast overnight. And that triggers the benefits of these intermittent fasting, or fasting in general, I should say, which we just went over. You can do this 3, 4, 5 days a week, depending on how you respond to it and how you like it. Moving on to nutrients for the blood-brain barrier and neuroinflammation. All of these can be found in whole foods. They can also be found in supplemental forms. Resveratrol is from grapes. It's a very powerful antioxidant and anti-inflammatory found in grapes and, yes, red wine. It also supports mitochondrial function. Rutin, same thing, found in citrus bioflavonoids, anti-inflammatory and antioxidant, and catechins from green tea, supports neuronal growth and balances the immune function, and is also an antioxidant. So all of these help with mitochondrial function, cleaning up our cellular factories. They help with reducing the immune response or reducing inflammation. Same thing with all of these as well. Curcumin, very powerful anti-inflammatory. There's thousands probably of research articles highlighting the benefits and anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer, antioxidant effects of curcumin. Omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA from fish oil. These you can get from eating salmon or like fatty fish like salmon, sardines. Some of the other fish are kind of higher in toxicity, which is why I don't like to name those as much. But these regulate the immune system and promote the resolution of the inflammatory response, which is why they're anti-inflammatory. In addition, the brain, like I said, is 60% fat, and these types of fat specifically help maintain the integrity of the neurons and their ability to relay electrochemical signals. Glutathione is like the body's primary antioxidant. It regenerates other antioxidants like vitamin C and vitamin E. It's also a powerful anti-inflammatory, immune regulator, and detoxifying agent. It also helps clean up our cellular factories, the mitochondria. And then vitamin D is also, just like everything else, anti-inflammatory. Just like everything else, anti-inflammatory. It also supports neurotransmitter and hormone synthesis and the integrity of cell membranes. So these are just a few nutrients to consider when trying to, promote brain health or act in preventative ways. Again, a whole foods, organic, brightly colored, ranging diet is a great way to support this too and get all of these nutrients. All right, looking at exercise in the brain. Exercise is one of the best things for the brain. And when I say exercise, I just mean sustained, consistent physical movement. Doesn't have to be pumping iron at a gym, doesn't have to be going for a run. It just has to be sustained. Ideally, higher intensity interval training can be done for as little as 10 minutes, but up to, if it's more of a sustained exercise, then ideally at least 30 minutes, most days of the week. So at least 4 or more days per week. I mean, yoga, walking, gardening, anything, dancing, anything that you like doing. I'm going to read this quote out loud though, because exercise, as this explains, is basically like a miracle grow for the brain. Exercise has the ability to cause the distinct release of brain-derived neurotropic factor, that's the miracle grow, allowing neurons to form dendritic branches to each other, so make connections to each other. BDNF is critical for the survival and growth of neuronal projections. So quite literally, exercise stimulates brain growth. It stimulates what's called arbitrization, which is the ability for neurons to make new connections, which at the end of the day is how we learn. That is how we do anything, is by neurons making these connections to each other. And exercise enhances this. It also, just to say, exercise enhances insulin sensitivity independent of diet, but especially when coupled with diet, enhances insulin sensitivity. It promotes the release of our feel-good brain chemicals like serotonin and dopamine. It's anti-inflammatory. I mean, exercise has a million benefits, and I know everyone listening knows that, but it's sometimes nice to reiterate it. And that's how it says here is exercise is just as effective, if not more, than antidepressant medications for moderate depression. So pretty significant. I would suggest trying to get in, half an hour, even just 10 minutes. You can YouTube high intensity interval training and find some 10-minute workouts, or just get in like half an hour of physical activity, something that you like doing at least 4 days a week. Your body and brain will thank you. All right, everyone, that's all I've got. You made it. You made it to the end. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope this information was helpful and that you got a few takeaways that you can start applying to your everyday life to help you save your brain. Thanks so much. Stay tuned. There'll be more videos coming out. Have a great rest of your day.